The corral gate was open when Rook Tilden walked back onto his own land. He had left it latched that morning, the way he always did, and now it hung loose in the late afternoon wind, swinging faintly on its iron hinges, and the corral behind it was empty. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at that emptiness for a moment. The packed dirt where the roan had stood for 4 years, the water trough with the surface barely disturbed, the fence posts casting long shadows across nothing. Then he walked to the trough and drank from it with both hands, because he had been walking for 3 hours in the kind of heat that turns the air above the ground into something almost solid, and his canteen had run dry before the second ridge. There are certain things a man does in his life that he cannot fully explain, not in the moment and not afterward. He can tell the facts, what he saw, what he said, what he decided. But the part underneath the facts, the part that moved his hand before his mind finished its calculation, that part resists language. Rook Tilden had given away his only horse that afternoon to a young Apache woman he had never met, and in the 3 hours of walking that followed, he had waited for regret to arrive, the way you wait for rain you can smell coming. It never came. That was the part he would not have known how to explain, even if someone had been there to ask. Nobody was there to ask. His ranch hand Farley had left for town 4 days ago and wasn't due back until the end of the week. Rook checked the milk cows, walked through the cabin once to make sure everything was as he'd left it, and then sat on the front step with his rifle across his knees and watched the sun flatten itself against the western ridgeline. Somewhere out there, north, past the canyon wall, past the dry creek, a woman he did not know was riding his horse toward wherever she needed to go. He hoped she made it. Rook had come to this valley from Kentucky a long time ago, a younger man then, with a wife named Clara and the kind of confidence that belongs only to people who haven't yet been seriously tested. Clara had died of fever 3 winters in. What he had after her was the ranch, 160 acres of dry but workable land, 200 head of cattle that kept him just solvent enough to stay, and the particular kind of quiet that either breaks a man or builds something in him that nothing can break later. It hadn't made him cold. Anyone who spent an afternoon with him would have said he was decent, unhurried, plain-spoken, but it had given him a settled quality that some men read as distance. He had already had his worst day. Everything since was just country to be crossed. He kept one horse because one horse was what the ranch needed, and he was not a man who kept things beyond what he needed. The roan had come to him at a sale 4 years prior, sound and honest in every condition the territory could offer. He had been, until that afternoon, the single most valuable thing on the Tilden property. The day it happened had begun like any other late summer day, pale at the edges before sunrise, heating fast once the sun cleared the ridge, the air dry enough to crack the skin on your hands. Rook had ridden out to check the northern fence line and was following a shallow arroyo through the scrubland when the roan slowed without being asked, ears forward, nostrils working. Rook knew what that meant. He stopped and listened. What he heard first was not a voice, but a particular silence, the silence of small creatures that have gone still because something nearby is wrong. The hawks he had been hearing all morning were gone. Then, faintly from somewhere upslope behind a broken formation of red rock, came the sound of horses standing, their tack shifting with the impatient movements of animals being held. 2 horses. They had not been there when he rode past an hour ago. He dismounted quietly, walked the roan to a tangle of scrub cedar, and moved upslope on foot. What he found when he came around the upper end of the outcrop was this: 2 armed men on horseback, working their way through the brush on the far side of a dry wash, and pressed flat against the back face of the largest rock, invisible to them from their angle, visible to Rook from his. A young woman holding a knife in each hand. She was Apache, wearing a deerskin dress and moccasins that had been hard used, her dark hair loose and tangled from running, She was watching the two riders with an expression that was not fear. It was the expression of someone who has already done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer they have accepted. The riders were white men carrying weapons that went well beyond what you needed for range work. Rifle, revolvers, a short-barreled shotgun across the saddle. They were combing the brush with the focused patience of men who were not hunting animals, and within another 5 minutes they were going to come around the rock formation and find the girl with nowhere left to go. Rook stood in the shadow of the outcrop and felt the particular cold clarity that comes over a man when the world strips itself down to its simplest terms. There were the two men. There was the girl. There was him. He moved. He came around the far end of the rock in the open with his Winchester raised and said in a carrying voice, "You two are going to want to stop where you are." The riders pulled up fast. The one with the rifle turned it immediately toward Rook. The other man's hands moved toward his revolvers and then stopped when he understood the geometry. That Rook already had his rifle shouldered and one of them was going to die before either hand cleared leather. The silence that followed had the weight of something being held back. "This is not your business," the man with the rifle said. "It is now," Rook said. He told them to turn their horses and ride east. He would stay where he was until they were over the ridge and out of sight, and if either one came back around in less than an hour, he would read it as a declaration and act accordingly. The man with the rifle held his position, running numbers on time and risk, then lowered the barrel and turned his horse without another word. The second man followed. Rook watched them until the ridge swallowed them and stood listening for the sound of doubling back. Nothing came. When he turned around, the girl was standing at the edge of the rock formation, both knives still in her hands, watching him. She was taller than he'd expected, and her face had the quality of a landscape that's used to weather. Not hardened exactly, but shaped by it. She looked at him the way you look at something you have not yet decided how to classify. He asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. He asked where she was going. She looked north without speaking, and that told him enough. North was the high canyon country, 2 hard days on foot from where they were standing. On a horse, half a day. He thought about that. He thought about the 2 riders going east and how long before they came back with more men and a clearer plan. A woman on foot with armed men behind her had poor odds. A woman on horseback had different odds entirely. He walked to the cedar scrub and brought the roan out. She did not move when he came toward her. She watched him with that careful, honest attention. He held the reins out. She looked at them. Then she said in English that was deliberate as if each word had been chosen in advance, "Why?" It was not a question about the horse. He understood that. It was the older question underneath. He said, "Because those men are coming back with more people, and you need to not be here when they do. And because I can walk home, and you cannot walk to where you're going before dark." He pointed north. "Take the east draw past the dry creek until you hit the canyon wall, then follow it north. There's a spring about a mile past the first bend. The roan knows where it is, he'll tell you." She took the reins. She mounted in a single motion, the kind that comes from a lifetime in the saddle, and the roan accepted her immediately. She looked down at him from the saddle one time, from under the full weight of that careful attention. Then she turned north and rode. He stood in the scrubland and watched her until the dust and the distance took her. And then he picked up his tool bag from the ground and started walking south toward home. Those 3 hours were long ones. The afternoon heat had no mercy for a man on foot, and the ground between the Arroyo and the Tilden Ranch was not generous. Broken rock and hard pan, and loose shale that wanted to send a man sideways at every step. He drank the last of his canteen water before the second ridge and came home dry and worn to the bone. He ate a cold supper, sat on the step with his rifle, and the evening came in around him, and he was fine. If you're finding this story worth your time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It keeps these stories coming, and it means more than you might think. Farley came back on the third day instead of the fifth. He looked at the empty corral. He looked at Rook. He looked at the corral again. He said, "Where's the horse?" Rook told him. The silence that followed was the kind a man produces when he is deciding between several things he wants to say and selecting the one that won't end his employment. Farley settled on, "You gave your horse to an Apache girl you'd never met." Rook said that was accurate. Farley took his hat off, looked at it, put it back on, and went to unload his saddlebags without another word. An hour later, he was working the cattle alongside Rook as though it had never come up, because Farley understood that some decisions belonged to the man who made them and not to the man hired to work alongside him. On the evening of the fourth day, a rider came through the southern gate. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, wearing clothes that were too clean for the territory. Not the clean of a man who had just washed, but the clean of a man whose clothes were expensive enough to stay clean in conditions where cheaper fabric would not. He rode a dark horse with a well-kept coat and stopped at the outer gate with the ease of someone accustomed to stopping at other people's gates and having those people come to him. His name was Gideon Stroud. He said the name the way men say names they expect to land heavily, with a small pause after to let the recognition arrive. Rook let the pause run out without filling it. Stroud recalibrated slightly and said he was looking for an Apache girl who had been traveling through this part of the territory, and that he had been told a rancher in this valley had intervened on her behalf. He said he simply wanted to have a conversation with her and clear up a confusion. He used the word confusion carefully, the way a man uses a tool he has found effective before. Then he looked at the empty corral and said, "I see you're short a horse." He left the observation on the table like a card and waited to see what Rook did with it. Stroud explained the situation with the patience of a man who had told this story many times and knew it well. He said there had been a land transaction some weeks prior involving certain Apache families and certain water rights in the northern canyon country. He said it was entirely legal, documented and signed. He said the girl had been present and had misrepresented what she'd seen to outside parties, causing complications for an arrangement that many people depended upon. He was a reasonable man, he said. He used that word too. Then he named a number, a meaningful one, the kind that would cover a new horse and 3 months of supplies with something left over, and said it was Rook's if he simply confirmed which direction the girl had gone. Rook looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the word reasonable and about the 2 armed men he had put his rifle on in the scrubland, and what a reasonable man sends riders after a lone woman for. He said he wasn't interested in the money. Stroud said everyone was at the right number. Rook said that hadn't been his experience. Stroud's expression shifted, not angry but cooler, and he said he would give Rook the night to think more carefully about his position, that men who found themselves on the wrong side of the territory's complications sometimes found those complications multiplying in ways they hadn't anticipated. He said it without raising his voice. Then he turned and rode back out the south gate. That night Rook didn't sleep much. Not from fear, though the fear was present and real. It was a manageable thing, old company by now, and he had learned to treat it as information rather than instruction. What kept him awake was the shape of what he was dealing with. Stroud had money, influence, and men within riding distance. The county judge was a man named Alford, whose name Stroud had mentioned with the casual familiarity of a man who ate Sunday dinner with someone. One rancher with one rifle and a ranch hand who was good-hearted but not a fighter. Those were not favorable odds by any straightforward calculation. He sat in the dark and cleaned his rifle and thought about the girl. He still did not know her name. He thought about the way she had asked why and about the answer he had given her. He thought it had been the truth. But underneath the practical reason, she was faster on horseback, the men behind her were not going to stop. was a simpler one he had not said aloud until that night. He had given her the horse because she had not asked him to, because she had been pressed against a rock with 2 knives and the odds running badly against her, and she had made no sound, had not appealed to anyone, had simply prepared to face what was in front of her on her own terms. That quality, that specific refusal to dissolve under pressure, had reminded him of Clara in the last week of her fever. The same eyes, not the eyes of a person waiting to be saved, the eyes of a person who was still, even then, deciding. She came back before the sun was up. He heard the roan's hoofbeats in the pre-dawn dark and was at the door with his rifle before he was fully awake, and then he heard her voice, low, saying his name. His name. He had not told her his name. He came out onto the step, and she was there in the blue pre-morning light, on the roan, and she was not alone. Behind her at the edge of the yard were 4 Apache riders, 2 men and 2 women, watching the cabin with the stillness of people who had decided to be present before they had decided to be visible. She dismounted and stood in front of him in the gray quiet and told him she had heard a man named Stroud had come to his ranch. He asked how she had heard that. She said her people watched. He did not press it further. Her name, she told him then, was Nalin. He told her his was Rook, which she already knew. They stood in the early dark, and she explained what she had been doing in the 4 days since she rode north on his horse. The land transaction Stroud called legal was not legal. Or rather, it was legal the way many things were legal in this territory, which meant the paperwork existed and the signatures were on it. But the signatures had been placed there by Apache elders who could not read English and who had been told under duress that they were signing an agreement about seasonal grazing boundaries. What they had actually signed was a transfer of water rights covering 30 miles of Canyon Creek to a mining operation backed by Stroud's capital. The water those rights covered was the water Apache families had relied upon for longer than there had been a county or a courthouse or a judge named Alford to sign off on anything. Nalin had been present at that signing. She had understood enough English to know what was being done. She could not stop it in the moment. So she had done the only other thing available to her. She had remembered everything, every name, every detail, and set out on horseback to find the people who needed to hear it. In 4 days, she had reached a land claims investigator who had been building a case in this territory for months. She had found a newspaper correspondent who had already published 2 pieces on Apache land dispossession and needed exactly the kind of documented testimony she could provide. She had found a circuit riding minister who had witnessed 2 similar transactions in neighboring counties and had been trying to file formal complaints without the evidence to make them stick. She had given all 3 of them her account, in detail, with names and dates and locations. She had asked each of them for a letter acknowledging her testimony. She pulled 3 letters from inside her dress and held them out. Rook took the letters and looked at them in the growing light. They were real documents, signed, dated, from people with names and positions and addresses outside this territory. The kind of paper that made things difficult to bury quietly. He looked up at her. He said quietly, "You did all of this in 4 days." She looked back at him with an expression that was not pride exactly, but was related to it. "Your horse is fast," she said. He almost smiled. Stroud came back the next morning as promised, this time with 4 men. They came through the southern gate and formed a loose arc in the yard, and Stroud rode to the front with the same clean clothes and the same pleasant, leveraged expression. Rook came out of the cabin. Nalin came out beside him. Farley came out behind them with a rifle, which surprised Rook, but not in a way he had time to address. And on the ridge above the ranch, visible, unhurried, placed where the morning light caught them fully, 5 Apache riders sat their horses in complete stillness. 2 carried rifles. 1 carried a bow resting loosely across his saddle, not drawn, the way a man rests a tool he knows where he put it. The ridge was the high ground. The high ground controlled the yard. Stroud could read terrain. He looked at the ridge for a long moment, and his 4 men shifted uneasily on either side of him. Rook spoke first. He said he had thought about Stroud's offer and had come to a decision, which was that he had nothing to tell him that Stroud was going to like. He said the girl was present if Stroud wanted to speak with her, and that anything she said she would say in the open air with witnesses. He added that he had spent the past 24 hours writing 2 letters of his own, one to the county land office in the territorial capital, one to the federal surveyor with jurisdiction over reservation-adjacent water rights, describing the visit Stroud had paid him, including the offer of money in exchange for information about a witness. He said the letters were going out with a rider that morning. He said this not as a threat, but as information, the same way a man names the weather. Then he took the 3 letters out of his shirt pocket and held them up in the morning light. He did not explain what they were. He let the sight of 3 formal documents, held by a man who was not standing in his yard alone, do the explaining. Stroud sat on his horse and his eyes moved to the letters, to Nalin, to the ridge, to his 4 men, and back to the letters. The calculation was visible in his face. The land deal depended on quiet, on the paperwork running its course before anyone with standing raised a question about it. Federal attention changed the landscape entirely. A federal surveyor asking questions about reservation water rights, combined with a newspaper correspondent who had already published on this subject, combined with a land claims investigator holding Nalin's testimony. That combination produced the exact opposite of quiet, in a territory Stroud had kept carefully quiet for years. He looked at Rook one last time. He said, "You've made your position very clear." Rook said he had tried. Stroud turned his horse without another word and rode south, and his 4 men followed, and Farley said into the silence they left behind them, in his usual tone of weary, philosophical resignation, "Well, that's a thing that happened." What followed was not clean or fast. The mining company's attorneys fought the land transfer in 2 separate territorial courts for most of a year, and Judge Alford did what he could for as long as he could, which turned out not to be long enough once the federal surveyor completed his report. Stroud eventually moved his operation to a different territory where his money still outweighed his reputation. The Apache families were not restored to everything they had been. These things never fully restored anyone to what they had been. But they kept the water, which was the thing that mattered most, and they kept it because a young woman had spent 4 days on a borrowed horse making sure the right people knew the truth. Nalin returned the roan before summer ended, with a length of braided leather threaded through the bridle and small turquoise beads worked into the cheekpiece. Fine work that made Farley stand looking at it for a full minute without speaking, which for Farley constituted a significant response. She came back a second time on a late afternoon in August, when the heat had broken enough to sit outside, and they talked on the porch step until the valley went dark. She about the canyon country north of his land, the springs and the old trails and the things her grandmother had taught her to read in the ridgelines. He about the soil and the fence lines, and how you could tell the season was turning by watching where the cattle drifted. It was not a dramatic conversation. It was the kind that goes unremarked upon, because it looks from the outside like 2 people simply talking. That is all it was. And it was also the beginning of something that had no name yet, but that both of them could feel the shape of in the fading light. What a man keeps and what he gives away. The frontier asked that question of everyone who came to it, and kept asking until it got an answer. Some men gave nothing, held everything, built fences until the fences were all they had. The ones who built something worth having were usually the ones who understood the difference between what a thing cost and what it was worth. Rook Tilden had not believed himself a courageous man. He had believed himself a practical one. But the afternoon he held out those reins in the scrubland had not been a practical decision. Something underneath the practical part of him had moved first, and it had been right. The roan went back to his old routines as though he had never been away. But sometimes, riding the northern fence line in the early morning, the horse would turn his head toward the canyon country without being asked and hold that attention for a moment before settling back to the trail. Rook let him look as long as he wanted. He figured whatever the roan had seen up north was worth remembering. Some things you give away come back. Some of them come back with more attached. And some of what they bring back with them you had not known you were missing until it returned and stood in your yard in the grey morning light and said your name. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories from the frontier coming, each one carrying something worth holding on to. And tell me in the comments, would you have handed over that horse? Given away your only way home for someone you didn't know, on a dusty slope in the middle of the afternoon, without asking anything back? I want to hear what you think.